The farmer Triplets' farmhouse cellar. They chained 44 women in their cellar, and what they did to them is terrifying. That's what 17-year-old Margaret Whitmore discovered when she lifted those loose floorboards in the Brennan brothers' barn. 44 wooden crosses, 44 names carved in the dark. The newest cross bore yesterday's date. The Brennan triplets were pillars of their Missouri community, generous to travelers, faithful to the church, trusted by everyone. But beneath their farmhouse lay a horror that had been growing for years. Women were vanishing along the Ozark settlements. Daughters, wives, sisters, all dismissed as runaways or troublemakers by the very people sworn to protect them. Margaret found the truth the authorities refused to see. She found the survivors chained in that cellar. She found the bodies buried in the fields, but when she tried to speak, the entire system turned against her. The sheriff, the judge, even her own father chose silence over justice. How do you fight evil when the whole world conspires to protect it? And how many more women would die before someone finally listened? The wagon wheel cracked with a sound like breaking bones, sending Margaret Whitmore lurching against her father's shoulder as their horse reared in the traces. Reverend Samuel Whitmore steadied the reins with practiced hands. His weathered face creased with concern as he surveyed the damage. The iron rim had split clean through, leaving jagged metal teeth that would tear the wooden wheel to splinters if they attempted to continue down the rocky Ozark Trail. "Lord's testing us today, Margaret," her father murmured, though his voice carried more frustration than faith. They were still 20 miles from the next settlement, with storm clouds gathering overhead like dark judgment. At 17, Margaret had accompanied her father on these monthly circuits through the remote Missouri Hill country, enough times to know that being stranded here meant accepting whatever hospitality they could find, and that such hospitality often came with complications. The Brennan farmhouse appeared through the trees like an answer to prayer. Its whitewashed walls and neat split-rail fences, speaking of prosperity and order in a region where both were scarce. Jeremiah Brennan himself emerged from the barn before they'd even called out, his broad shoulders and graying beard marking him as the eldest of the famous triplets. Behind him came his brothers, Ezekiel with his gentle smile and soft-spoken manner, and Caleb, whose pale eyes seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "Reverend Whitmore!" Jeremiah's voice boomed across the yard with genuine warmth. "What brings you to our humble corner of God's creation?" His expression shifted to concern as he noted their damaged wheel. "Ah, I see the Lord's put you in need of assistance. Brothers, we have guests who require our Christian charity." Margaret had heard nothing but praise for the Brennan triplets throughout the Hill communities. They donated generously to every church, provided food for struggling families, and opened their home to travelers without hesitation. Sheriff Coleman Brass himself had once remarked that the territory would be blessed to have more men of such character. As Jeremiah and Ezekiel helped her father unload their belongings, Margaret found herself studying Caleb, who remained silent beside the barn door, his unblinking gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You'll stay the night, of course," Ezekiel insisted, his voice soft as spring rain. "Martha, that's our housekeeper. She's prepared a fine supper, and we've got comfortable beds for weary travelers. Come morning, Jeremiah can fix that wheel good as new." He gestured toward the farmhouse with genuine hospitality, though Margaret noticed how Caleb's eyes followed her every movement as they crossed the yard. The farmhouse interior spoke of careful maintenance and modest prosperity. Clean wooden floors, simple but sturdy furniture, and religious texts displayed prominently on shelves and tables. Martha, a stern-faced woman of perhaps 50, served a meal of cornbread, salt pork, and preserved vegetables, while the brothers entertained her father with stories of their various charitable works throughout the region. They spoke of widows whose roofs they'd repaired, orphans they'd fed, and struggling families they'd helped through difficult seasons. "The Lord has blessed us with abundance," Jeremiah explained, his weathered hands gesturing expansively. And abundance shared is abundance multiplied. We consider it our Christian duty to help those in need, especially the vulnerable ones, women traveling alone, immigrants without family connections, those who might otherwise fall through the cracks of society's protection. Margaret noticed how Caleb's fork paused against his plate when his brother spoke of vulnerable women, though his expression remained unchanged. Something in that momentary stillness sent ice through her veins, though she couldn't articulate why. When her father launched into one of his familiar sermons about the parable of the Good Samaritan, she excused herself to step outside for air, claiming the indoor warmth had made her lightheaded. The Missouri night had turned crisp, with autumn's first bite carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Margaret wandered toward the barn, drawn by restlessness she couldn't explain. The building loomed larger in darkness, its weathered boards silvered by moonlight. She'd always been curious by nature, a trait her father alternately praised and worried would lead her into improper situations, and something about the farm's too-perfect order struck her as deliberate, like a stage set designed to convince, rather than simply exist. The barn door stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness within. Margaret pushed it open wider, letting moonlight spill across hay bales and farming implements arranged with military precision. But as she moved deeper into the space, her foot caught on something that shouldn't have been there, a loose floorboard that shifted under her weight, with a hollow sound that spoke of empty space beneath. Curiosity overrode caution as Margaret knelt beside the loose boards. They lifted easily, as if they'd been disturbed many times before, revealing wooden steps descending into absolute darkness. The smell that rose from below made her stomach clench, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else she couldn't identify but instinctively recognized as the scent of fear itself. Margaret fumbled for the oil lamp hanging beside the barn door, her hands shaking as she lit it with matches from her dress pocket. The flame cast dancing shadows as she descended the crude steps, each creak of old wood beneath her feet sounding loud as gunshots in the oppressive silence. The cellar opened before her like a vision from the darkest chapters of Revelation, a space that spoke of suffering so profound it seemed to have soaked into the very stones. Dozens of women's belongings lay scattered across the earthen floor like the remnants of interrupted lives. Hair ribbons and collars that had once been bright, jewelry tarnished black with age and neglect, fragments of clothing torn and stained beyond recognition, but it was the far wall that stole the breath from her lungs and sent the lamp trembling in her grip. 44 wooden crosses, each no larger than her hand, arranged in neat rows like a cemetery for the damned. Each cross bore a name carved with crude precision: Mary Sullivan, Ruth Freeman, Elizabeth Morrison, names that spoke of real women who had once drawn breath and felt hope and fear. Dates accompanied the names, some reaching back 5 years, others frighteningly recent. The newest cross, its wood still pale from fresh carving, bore yesterday's date and a name that made Margaret's blood freeze: Bridget Ali. Footsteps on the barn floor above sent panic racing through her veins. Margaret blew out the lamp and pressed herself against the cellar wall as heavy boots moved across the space overhead. Through the loose floorboards, she glimpsed Caleb Brennan's pale face peering down, his eyes reflecting what little moonlight penetrated the barn like a predator's. For a moment that lasted eternity, their gazes met through the gaps in the wooden floor. Then he smiled, an expression devoid of warmth or humanity that confirmed every instinct that had screamed warnings since their arrival. Margaret remained frozen until his footsteps retreated, then climbed the cellar steps on legs that barely supported her weight. She replaced the loose boards with hands that shook like autumn leaves, her mind struggling to process the horror she'd witnessed. The Brennan brothers, pillars of their community, generous benefactors, trusted friends, were monsters hiding behind masks of Christian charity. And now Caleb knew she'd seen their terrible secret. As Margaret slipped back toward the farmhouse, she caught sight of him standing at the kitchen window, his pale eyes tracking her movement across the yard. Tomorrow they would leave this place. But Margaret understood with chilling certainty that the horror she'd discovered would follow her long after their wagon wheel was mended and they returned to the supposed safety of civilization. The question that would haunt her dreams was not what the Brennan brothers had done to 44 women, but how many more would die before someone found the courage to make the world believe the impossible truth. Margaret's hands trembled as she tried to pour her father's morning coffee, the memory of those 44 crosses burning behind her eyes like brands. She'd barely slept, every creak of the farmhouse settling, making her wonder if Caleb Brennan was coming for her. When she'd finally worked up the courage to tell her father what she'd discovered, his reaction had been swift and devastating. "Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, you will not bear false witness against these good Christian men," he'd said, his voice sharp with embarrassment and fear. "Whatever you think you saw in the darkness was the product of an overwrought imagination. The Brennan brothers are pillars of this community." But Margaret knew what she'd seen, and more importantly, she knew what it meant. As their repaired wagon rolled away from the farm that morning, she caught sight of Caleb watching from the barn door, that same cold smile playing at his lips. He touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy, and Margaret understood the gesture for what it was, a promise that their paths would cross again. Her father refused to discuss the matter further, treating her attempts to speak of it as symptoms of feminine hysteria that required firm correction rather than consideration. The next 3 weeks became a torment of investigation, disguised as routine visits to outlying settlements. While her father conducted his pastoral duties, Margaret quietly spoke with families throughout the region, asking careful questions about missing daughters, sisters, wives. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The Brennan brothers hadn't just been killing women. They'd been systematically targeting the most vulnerable members of society, knowing their disappearances would be dismissed or ignored entirely. In Pine Ridge, she met the Sullivans, whose 17-year-old daughter Mary had vanished 2 years prior while walking to the neighboring farm to help with a difficult birth. "Sheriff Brass said she likely ran off with some traveling man," Mrs. Sullivan told Margaret, her eyes hollow with grief that had never been allowed proper expression. "Said girls like Mary, with their heads full of romantic notions, they don't think about the shame they bring on their families. But Mary wasn't that kind of girl, miss. She was good as gold." At the Morrison homestead, Margaret learned that Elizabeth Morrison had disappeared after accepting work as a seamstress for respectable folks over near Brennan Ridge. When Elizabeth failed to return home as promised, her family's inquiries were met with claims that she had been dismissed for theft and had fled the county in disgrace. "But Elizabeth never stole so much as an apple in her life," her brother John insisted, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "She sent money home regular-like until one day the letters just stopped. Sheriff said there wasn't nothing to investigate." The pattern became clear with each family Margaret visited. Women who disappeared were systematically discredited by the authorities, painted as immoral, unstable, or criminal to justify the lack of investigation into their fates. Sheriff Coleman Brass had refused every request for search parties or inquiries, dismissing grieving families with callous efficiency. Margaret realized she was documenting not just individual tragedies, but evidence of a coordinated campaign to silence entire communities. Her breakthrough came when she encountered Moses Freeman, the freed slave who worked as the town's blacksmith. Margaret had been drawn to his shop by the sound of hammer on anvil, a rhythm that reminded her of heartbeats, steady, strong, defiant. Moses was a man of perhaps 45, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing, much like her father's, but without the willful blindness that plagued Samuel Whitmore. "You're asking about missing women," Moses said without preamble as Margaret approached his forge, his voice carrying the careful modulation of a man who'd learned to navigate white society without surrendering his dignity. Word travels fast in small places, Miss Whitmore. Folks are talking about the preacher's daughter going house to house, stirring up old sorrows. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. But Moses raised a hand before she could speak. I'm not criticizing, child. I'm saying you're not the only one who's noticed the pattern. My Ruth disappeared 2 years back, took a position as seamstress for the Brennan brothers, was supposed to come home every Sunday for supper. When she stopped coming, I went looking. His hammer struck the red-hot iron with particular force. Sheriff Brass told me Ruth had gone back south where she belonged, said freed slaves were naturally drawn to wandering, and I shouldn't expect loyalty from her kind. The bitterness in Moses's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear the grief underneath it. But you didn't believe him, she said. Moses set down his hammer and looked at her directly, his eyes measuring her carefully. Miss Whitmore, I've been keeping records of every woman who has gone missing in this county for the past 5 years. 43 names, ages, descriptions, last known whereabouts, every family dismissed by Sheriff Brass. Every disappearance explained away as moral failing or natural wandering. You want to know why I started counting? Because Ruth was the smartest person I ever knew, and she would never have just vanished without word. Someone killed my daughter, and that same someone has been killing women all across these hills. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized she'd found the ally she desperately needed. Moses Freeman wasn't just another grieving father. He was a man who'd been systematically documenting the very evidence she'd been stumbling toward. When she told him about the crosses in the Brennan cellar, about the 44 names carved in wood, his expression shifted from weariness to grim determination. 44, he repeated softly. I had 43 on my list. Ruth Freeman was number 43. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that mathematics settling between them like a gravestone. Moses walked to a wooden chest beside his forge and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with careful handwriting. Every name, every date, every family that's been told their grief doesn't matter. I figured someday someone would want to know the truth. Margaret opened the ledger with reverent care, scanning pages of meticulous documentation that represented years of patient investigation. Moses had recorded not just names and dates, but patterns of behavior, connections between victims, and most importantly, evidence that the disappearances were being deliberately covered up by local authorities. "Why didn't you take this to federal marshals?" she asked. Moses's laugh was bitter. "Miss Whitmore, I'm a freed slave in Missouri. My word against white men, especially respected white men, isn't worth the breath it takes to speak it. But your word, the daughter of a preacher, educated, white, respectable, that carries weight I'll never have." He leaned forward, his voice urgent. "But we need more than accusations. We need proof that even corrupt officials can't dismiss." As Margaret studied Moses's documentation, a terrible realization began to form. The Brennan farm sat at a crucial crossroads where 3 counties met: Crawford, Gasconade, and Maries, making jurisdiction deliberately unclear. When families reported missing women, Sheriff Brass could claim the disappearance occurred in a different county, requiring them to seek help elsewhere. But when they tried, officials in those counties would defer to Brass's authority, creating an endless circle of past responsibility that ensured no real investigation ever took place. "It's not just incompetence," Margaret whispered, her finger tracing the careful notations in Moses's ledger. "It's deliberate. They've designed the system to protect the Brennan brothers." Moses nodded grimly. "And it goes deeper than just the sheriff. Judge Cornelius Wade signs every dismissal order, every refusal to investigate. The brothers have money, influence, political connections, reaching all the way to Jefferson City. They've built themselves a perfect machine for murder, and every official in 3 counties helps keep it running." Margaret closed the ledger, her mind reeling with the scope of the conspiracy she'd uncovered. 44 women were dead, their bodies buried on the Brennan farm, their families silenced by a system designed to value the reputation of their killers over the lives of their victims. But now she and Moses had documentation, evidence, names and dates that could no longer be dismissed as hysteria or imagination. The question that haunted her was whether anyone with real power would be willing to listen, or whether the conspiracy reached too high for justice to ever find purchase. The plan Margaret and Moses devised was born of desperation and fueled by righteous fury. They would conduct nighttime surveillance of the Brennan farm, gathering evidence that even the most corrupt officials couldn't dismiss. Moses had fashioned a special tool from his blacksmith materials, a thin iron rod that could be used to peer through cellar windows without detection. Margaret had stolen her father's field glasses, justifying the theft as necessary for God's work, though she doubted the Almighty would approve of her methods, even if he blessed her cause. 3 nights of careful observation revealed patterns that chilled Margaret to her bones. The brothers worked with methodical precision, taking turns at different tasks. Jeremiah handled the business side, meeting with well-dressed men who arrived in covered wagons, conducting transactions that involved the exchange of money and human cargo. Ezekiel managed the psychological manipulation, using his gentle demeanor to calm frightened women and convince them to trust their captors. But it was Caleb who revealed himself as the most dangerous, prowling the property like a predator and administering punishments with savage efficiency. On the 4th night, they witnessed a horror that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her days. A young woman with auburn hair and an Irish accent arrived at the farm in the back of a merchant ES wagon, clutching a letter that promised honest work and fair wages. Margaret recognized her immediately from Moses's descriptions. Bridget Ali, the 19-year-old immigrant whose cross she'd seen in the cellar, whose date of death had been yesterday when Margaret first discovered the horror. But Bridget Ali wasn't dead. She was very much alive, and she was about to become the 45th victim of the Brennan brothers' systematic evil. Margaret watched in paralyzed horror as Ezekiel welcomed Bridget with his trademark gentleness, offering her food and shelter while explaining the wonderful opportunity that awaited her. The young woman's relief was palpable. She'd been traveling for weeks, sleeping rough and going hungry, desperate for the safety and respectability the brothers promised. "We have to do something," Margaret whispered to Moses, who lay beside her in the tall grass overlooking the farm. His jaw was clenched with the same mixture of rage and helplessness that consumed her. "We can't just watch them take another innocent woman." Moses's response was barely audible, but filled with grim determination. "We can't save her by getting ourselves killed, Miss Margaret, but maybe we can save the others." He pointed toward the cellar windows, where faint light revealed movement below. "Look there. She's not alone." Margaret adjusted the field glasses and gasped. Through the grimy cellar windows, she could see not just Bridget being led down the wooden steps, but other figures moving in the shadows. Other women alive, imprisoned, waiting for rescue or death. The cross with Bridget's name hadn't marked her death, but her capture, her entry into a hell that might last days, weeks, or months before her suffering finally ended. "How many do you think are down there?" Margaret asked, her voice barely steady. Moses had been counting shadows, his blacksmith's precision applied to the most horrible mathematics imaginable. 6, maybe 7. Hard to tell in the dim light, but they're alive, Miss Margaret. They're all still alive. The realization that they could actually save living women, rather than simply avenge dead ones, transformed their mission from documentation to rescue, but it also exponentially increased the danger. The brothers weren't just killers. They were slave traders operating a sophisticated network that stretched far beyond their remote Missouri farm. Margaret and Moses were about to pit themselves against not just three murderous men, but an entire system of corruption and complicity. Their first attempt at rescue came 2 nights later, when all three brothers had traveled to town for what Jeremiah announced as important business meetings. Margaret and Moses approached the farm with tools Moses had crafted specifically for breaking locks and prying open doors. The cellar entrance was secured with a heavy iron padlock, but Moses's skills made quick work of it. The smell that rose from the cellar was worse than Margaret remembered. Human waste, unwashed bodies, infection, and the sour stench of despair itself. But underneath it all was something that made her heart soar with hope. The sound of women's voices, weak but alive, speaking in whispers of comfort and defiance. These weren't broken victims waiting to die. They were survivors clinging to life and sanity through mutual support and stubborn refusal to surrender. Bridget O'Malley was chained near the entrance, her auburn hair matted and her green dress torn, but her eyes blazed with undiminished spirit. Behind her, Margaret could make out 5 other women of various ages, all bearing the physical marks of captivity, but none displaying the broken submission their captors had tried to create. "Who are you?" Bridget whispered in her lilting Irish accent. "Are you here to help us or hurt us more?" "We're here to get you out," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "My name is Margaret Whitmore, and this is Moses Freeman. We know what the Brennan brothers have done, and we're going to make sure they face justice for it." The process of freeing 6 women from their chains while maintaining absolute silence proved more difficult than Margaret had anticipated. Each woman was secured with different restraints, some bearing evidence of multiple escape attempts that had been brutally punished. Moses worked with methodical efficiency, his blacksmith tools making quick work of crude iron shackles, while Margaret helped steady the weakened women and offered what comfort she could. But as they prepared to lead the rescued women from the cellar, disaster struck with devastating swiftness. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard above sent ice through Margaret's veins. The brothers had returned early from their business in town, and light from their lanterns was already casting moving shadows across the barn floor. Margaret and Moses found themselves trapped in the cellar with 6 traumatized women, facing the terrible choice between attempting an escape that would likely result in everyone's death, or remaining hidden and hoping the brothers wouldn't discover their presence. Caleb Brennan's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "Something's wrong. The lock's been broken." His footsteps moved across the barn floor with predatory certainty, and Margaret realized he was following their trail with the skill of a born hunter. Within moments, his pale face appeared at the top of the cellar stairs, and his cold smile spread like poison when he saw the group huddled below. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the satisfied purr of a cat that had cornered several mice at once. "Miss Margaret Whitmore and her Negro friend have come in calling, and they've been disturbing our guests." He descended the stairs slowly, savoring the terror his presence inspired, while his brothers' voices could be heard above, discussing how to handle the situation. Moses stepped protectively in front of Margaret and the freed women, his blacksmith hammer gripped like a weapon. "You let these women go, Brennan. This ends tonight." Caleb's laughter was like breaking glass. "Oh, it ends tonight, all right, but not the way you planned." He pulled a pistol from his coat, its metal glinting in the lantern light. "You've caused us considerable inconvenience, Miss Whitmore, cost us time, money, and reputation that requires compensation." The confrontation that followed would be seared into Margaret's memory forever. Moses charged Caleb with desperate courage, taking a bullet in his shoulder, but managing to knock the gun from the killer's hand. In the chaos that followed, Margaret and the rescued women fought their way up the cellar stairs, while Moses grappled with Caleb in the darkness below. By the time they reached the surface, Jeremiah and Ezekiel were waiting with rifles, but the night itself had become their ally. Margaret led the women through the darkness toward the abandoned mineshaft they had selected as a hiding place. Her heart breaking as she heard Moses cry out in pain behind them. They'd managed to rescue 6 innocent women, but the cost was becoming clear. Moses Freeman, the man whose courage and documentation had made their mission possible, was now fighting for his life against monsters who showed no mercy to those who dared oppose them. The abandoned mine shaft became both sanctuary and prison for Margaret and the 6 rescued women. Hidden among the timber supports and forgotten mining equipment, they huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of pursuit echoing across the Missouri hills. The Brennan brothers had mobilized every ally they possessed. Sheriff Brass's deputies, local militiamen, even volunteers from the community who believed they were hunting dangerous criminals rather than helping cover up systematic murder. Margaret's hands shook as she tended to the wounds of the rescued women, using strips torn from her petticoat to bandage cuts and abrasions that spoke of prolonged abuse. Bridget Ali, despite her own trauma, had emerged as the natural leader among the survivors, her Irish accent soft but determined as she whispered words of comfort to the others. "We're alive," she repeated like a prayer. "They didn't break us, and we're alive." But Margaret's heart was breaking with each passing hour. Moses Freeman had not emerged from that cellar, and the smoke rising from the direction of the Brennan farm suggested the brothers were destroying evidence with methodical efficiency. When she'd made the desperate decision to lead the women to safety, she left behind the one man who shown the courage to document their crimes and fight for justice. The weight of that choice threatened to crush her spirit entirely. On the second day of hiding, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Sheriff Coleman Brass himself appeared at the mine entrance, his badge glinting in the afternoon sunlight and his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. Behind him stood Deputy Marshal Frank Collins, a federal officer whose presence should have offered hope, but whose cold expression suggested otherwise. Margaret realized with growing horror that the corruption reached even higher than she'd imagined. "Miss Margaret Whitmore," Sheriff Brass called into the darkness, his voice carrying false concern that fooled no one. "You and your companions need to come out now. There are serious charges pending. Assault on respected citizens, theft of property, inciting racial violence. But if you surrender peacefully, I'm sure we can work out some kind of understanding." Margaret knew better than to trust Brass's promises. But the rescued women were weakening from hunger and exposure, and several were showing signs of infection from their untreated wounds. When she whispered her concerns to Bridget, the Irish woman's response was fierce. "Better to die free than live as their slaves," she said. "We know what they'll do to us if we go back." But Margaret's worst fears were realized when Deputy Marshal Collins stepped forward and announced his true purpose. "Miss Whitmore, I have warrants for your arrest on charges of criminal conspiracy, assault with deadly weapons, and inciting slave rebellion. The Negro Moses Freeman has confessed to leading you astray with false accusations against the Brennan brothers. He's admitted that his supposed documentation was fabricated to settle personal grievances." The lie hit Margaret like a physical blow. Moses would never have recanted his carefully documented evidence, which meant either he was dead and they were using his name to legitimize their persecution, or he was being tortured into false confessions. Either possibility filled her with rage and despair in equal measure. The system she hoped to reform had revealed itself as thoroughly corrupted, with federal authority itself compromised by the Brennan brothers' reach and influence. Margaret's attempt to present the rescued women as witnesses collapsed immediately when Sheriff Brass announced that all 6 would be charged with prostitution, vagrancy, and making false accusations against upstanding citizens. "These unfortunate women have been led astray by radical northern ideas," he proclaimed, his voice carrying practiced authority. They'd been convinced to make wild claims against men who were trying to help them find honest work. It is a sad commentary on how outside agitators can corrupt the simple minds of the vulnerable. The devastating effectiveness of this strategy became clear as Margaret watched the community's response to their capture. The same families who died wept over their missing daughters now turned away as the rescued women were paraded through town in shackles. The narrative had been perfectly crafted. Margaret was painted as a disturbed young woman influenced by abolitionist extremism, while Moses Freeman was described as a resentful former slave seeking revenge against white benefactors. Judge Cornelius Wade's courtroom became a theater of orchestrated injustice where truth itself was on trial. Margaret discovered that Wade was not merely corrupt, but was actually Jeremiah Brennan's brother-in-law, a family connection that explained the perfect coordination between the judicial system and the killers it protected. When Margaret attempted to present Moses's documentation as evidence, Judge Wade ruled it inadmissible as the fabricated ravings of a known criminal and racial agitator. The rescued women's testimony was systematically destroyed through character assassination and legal technicalities. Bridget Ali, whose spirit had sustained the others during their captivity, broke down completely when Judge Wade announced that her immigrant status made her testimony worthless, and that she would be deported immediately after serving her sentence for false accusations. One by one, the other survivors recanted their stories under the combined pressure of legal threats, social ostracism, and the promise of lenient treatment if they admitted their confusion. Margaret's father's betrayal cut deepest of all. Reverend Samuel Whitmore appeared in court not to support his daughter, but to publicly denounce her actions and request the court's mercy for what he described as a young woman led astray by dangerous ideas. His testimony painted Margaret as mentally unstable, subject to hysteria and delusions that had been encouraged by her association with radical elements in the community. "My daughter has always been prone to excessive imagination," he testified, his voice steady, but his eyes unable to meet Margaret's gaze. "I fear her recent behavior stems from reading inappropriate literature about Northern abolitionists and women's suffrage movements. These ideas have clearly disturbed her natural feminine sensibilities and led her to make accusations against men whose only crime was showing Christian charity to those in need." The personal cost of pursuing justice became a crushing weight as Margaret sat in her jail cell, awaiting transfer to the state asylum where Judge Wade had ordered her committed for mental treatment. Through her barred window she could see smoke rising from the direction of Moses Freeman's blacksmith shop, and she knew the last evidence of the Brennan brothers' crimes was being systematically erased. The ledger containing 5 years of meticulous documentation had been dismissed as fantasy, and its author had vanished entirely from official records. But the final betrayal came when Margaret learned the true scope of the conspiracy protecting the Brennan brothers. Deputy Marshal Collins revealed with casual cruelty that the trafficking operation extended far beyond Missouri's borders with buyers and sellers in Kansas City, St. Louis, New Orleans, and as far east as Chicago. The Brennan farm was merely one node in a network that generated enormous profits for everyone involved, from local officials to federal marshals to judges and politicians whose campaigns had been generously funded by the trade in human suffering. "You really thought you could bring down something this big?" Collins asked, his voice filled with genuine amazement at her naivety. "Miss Whitmore, you stumbled onto an operation that involves some of the most powerful men in the state. Did you honestly believe they'd let a preacher's daughter and a freed slave destroy decades of careful work?" As Margaret was led away to begin her journey to the asylum, she caught sight of Caleb Brennan standing outside the courthouse, his pale eyes following her with satisfied malice. He touched the brim of his hat in the same mocking salute he'd given her that morning at the farm. And Margaret understood that he was savoring not just her defeat, but her complete destruction. The man who'd killed 44 women had not only escaped justice, but had turned the system itself into a weapon against those who dared seek the truth. The last thing Margaret saw before the asylum wagon doors closed was Bridget Ali being loaded onto a different transport, her spirit finally broken by the realization that speaking truth had only brought more suffering. In that moment, Margaret understood the full horror of what they'd been fighting. Not just individual evil, but a system so thoroughly corrupted that justice itself had become impossible, and truth had become the most dangerous lie of all. Margaret's escape from the asylum transport came not through her own planning, but through the intervention of forces she'd never expected to find in the corrupt landscape of Missouri justice. As the wagon carrying her toward what she knew would be permanent imprisonment jolted along the rutted road, a group of armed men emerged from the forest like avenging angels. But these weren't the Brennan brothers' allies. They were federal marshals operating under direct orders from Washington, led by a stern-faced woman whose presence commanded immediate respect and fear. Emma Goldman introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to working in hostile territory. She was an investigative journalist whose reputation for exposing corruption had reached the highest levels of government. And Margaret's case had attracted her attention through channels the local conspirators never could have anticipated. Goldman's network of contacts included abolitionists, women's rights advocates, and federal officials who'd grown increasingly concerned about reports of systematic lawlessness in the Missouri Territory. "Miss Whitmore," Goldman said as the federal marshals freed Margaret from her restraints. "Your father E.S. correspondence with church authorities in Jefferson City included details he probably thought would discredit you. Instead, they confirmed patterns we've been tracking across multiple states. You've stumbled onto something much larger than a local murder conspiracy." Goldman's weathered face bore the lines of someone who'd spent years fighting impossible battles, and her eyes held the same determination that had driven Margaret to pursue justice, despite overwhelming opposition. The journey to St. Louis became Margaret's introduction to the scope of the network she'd been fighting. Goldman explained that the Brennan operation was part of a regional trafficking system that had been operating since the end of the Civil War, exploiting the chaos of Reconstruction to prey upon the most vulnerable members of society. Federal investigators had been tracking similar operations in Arkansas, Kansas, and Tennessee, but local corruption had made prosecution nearly impossible until Margaret E.S. documentation provided the missing links they needed. "Moses Freeman's ledger survived," Goldman told her as their carriage rolled toward the city. "Before he died, he managed to hide his documentation in a place only you would think to look, buried beneath the headstone of his daughter Ruth in the colored cemetery outside town. Federal agents recovered it 2 days ago, and it's provided evidence of crimes spanning 5 states and involving dozens of officials." The news of Moses's death hit Margaret like a physical blow, but Goldman's next revelation offered a glimmer of hope amidst the grief. "He didn't die in that cellar, Miss Whitmore. Moses Freeman lived long enough to testify before federal investigators, and his testimony has triggered the largest criminal investigation in Missouri's history. The man you thought you abandoned actually managed to expose the entire network before succumbing to his injuries." In St. Louis, Margaret discovered that her story had already begun to transform from local scandal into national outrage. Goldman's initial article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had been picked up by newspapers across the country, and the combination of documented evidence and surviving witness testimony had created a firestorm of public indignation that corrupt officials could no longer contain or dismiss. The federal courthouse became the stage for a different kind of justice than Margaret had experienced in Judge Wade's corrupt courtroom. Here, evidence was evaluated rather than dismissed. Witnesses were protected rather than intimidated, and the full weight of federal authority was brought to bear against the network of corruption that had protected the Brennan brothers for so long. Margaret Wade's testimony, delivered before a packed courtroom and recorded by stenographers for national distribution, became the centerpiece of a case that exposed not just the murders on the Brennan farm, but the systematic conspiracy that had enabled them. She spoke for Moses Freeman, whose voice had been silenced, but whose documentation lived on as irrefutable evidence. She spoke for the 44 women whose crosses she'd discovered in that terrible cellar, and she spoke for the survivors who had found the courage to testify despite years of trauma and intimidation. But the true breakthrough came when Bridget Ali, who'd been intercepted before her deportation, took the witness stand with a strength that amazed everyone present. The Irish immigrant who had been broken by Judge Wade's threats had found her voice again, and her testimony about the trafficking network's operations provided details that corroborated evidence from multiple states. "They told us we were worthless," Bridget said, her accent clear and strong as she faced the packed courtroom. "They told us no one would believe us, no one would care if we lived or died, but Margaret Whitmore cared, Moses Freeman cared, and now you're all here listening to our voices, knowing that we mattered enough to fight for." The federal investigation revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Margaret had stumbled upon. The Brennan brothers weren't just local killers, they were regional distributors in a network that stretched from New Orleans to Chicago, trafficking vulnerable women to brothels, forced labor camps, and private buyers throughout the expanding territories. Judge Wade, Sheriff Brass, and dozens of other officials had been receiving regular payments to ensure the operation's protection. The trials that followed became a reckoning that shattered the corrupt system, protecting systematic evil throughout the region. Jeremiah and Caleb Brennan were convicted and sentenced to hang, though Ezekiel had taken his own life before trial to avoid facing his victim's testimony. Judge Wade and Sheriff Brass received prison sentences that effectively ended their careers and influence, while dozens of lesser officials faced prosecution or disgrace. Margaret found herself transformed from a discredited young woman into a symbol of courage and moral determination. Speaking invitations came from women's rights organizations, church groups, and reform societies throughout the country. Her story became a rallying cry for those fighting systematic injustice, and her testimony helped inspire federal legislation aimed at preventing similar conspiracies. But the personal and reform societies throughout the country. Her story became a rallying cry for those fighting systematic injustice, and her testimony helped inspire federal legislation aimed at preventing similar conspiracies. But the personal cost of justice remained heavy. Margaret's relationship with her father never fully recovered from his betrayal during the trials. Though Reverend Whitmore eventually acknowledged his moral cowardice and spent his remaining years working to support families affected by trafficking, the trauma of witnessing such systematic evil, combined with the knowledge of how close the entire conspiracy had come to success, left psychological scars that would never fully heal. 5 years after the trials, Margaret stood in the small cemetery where Moses Freeman was buried, placing flowers on his headstone alongside those marking the graves of the 44 women whose bodies had finally been recovered and properly interred. The federal investigation had identified each victim, returned their remains to their families when possible, and ensured that their names were recorded not as forgotten casualties, but as individuals whose lives had meaning and whose deaths demanded justice. Margaret had married Thomas Hartwell, one of the federal prosecutors who'd helped bring the conspiracy to trial, and together they'd established safe houses for trafficking survivors throughout the Missouri Territory. Their work continued the mission that had begun in that terrible cellar beneath the Brennan barn, ensuring that vulnerable women had protection, that their voices were heard, and that their lives mattered in a society that too often dismissed their suffering. As she stood among the headstones bearing the names she'd first seen carved on wooden crosses, Margaret reflected on the price of pursuing justice in a world designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Moses Freeman had paid with his life. The survivors had paid with years of trauma, and she had paid with her innocence and faith in the institutions that were supposed to protect society's most vulnerable members. But they had also gained something precious: the knowledge that evil could be exposed and defeated when people found the courage to speak truth to power. The 44 crosses in that cellar had been markers of forgotten lives. But the 44 headstones in this peaceful cemetery bore witness to something more powerful: the truth that every life matters, and that silence in the face of systematic evil makes us all complicit in perpetuating it.